Welcome back to Project Phoenix 83, the show where we try and turn this into a race car. So in the last episode we got the car running, so now we can continue with the build. What is the build? Well, the build is what I need to do to the car to get it down the quarter mile as quickly as possible. And whenever I think about anyone designing a car, I think of Jesse and Brian in the Fast and Furious movie, where they start planning the build of their Supra. So tell me what you think about this. They've got Koni adjustables. They're going to save us about £2. And they're going to give us better traction out of the whole shot. Alright, this is your basic layout of the car. It's pretty much what it could look like when it's done. You know, red, green. I should be going to MIT. Yeah, right. I got that attention deficit, ADD, yeah, that. I don't know, there's just something about cars that calms me down. Now when I say quickly as possible, I'm talking about as fast as I have ever been, and that is 13.666 seconds. Now, I know this because I used to race my MR2, which I talked about in a previous episode. Now, when I went to Santa Pod Raceway in the UK, they gave you a time slip, and here's my time slip, and it shows 13.666 seconds with an ending speed of 105 miles an hour and an awful reaction time. So I want to go faster than that. Now, one of the things you need to consider is some race theory. So how much horsepower do you need to go a certain speed? Well, there's actually some basic equations to help that, and I'll talk about those now. Okay, so I wanted to quickly go over a bit of race theory, and this is a very simple one, and it's just how much power you need to get a car weighing a certain amount down a quarter mile at a given time. So sometimes people use this to work out how powerful their cars are. So if they go to the drag strip, they build their car, they go to the drag strip and they hit it in 10 seconds and they know how heavy their car is, they can work out how much horsepower they have. The other thing you can do is, if you know how heavy your car is and you know how much horsepower you've made because you had your engine built or you were on a dynometer, you can use that to work out how fast you're going to be on the quarter mile. Now, I did both with my MR2. I took it on a dyno and I took it to the quarter mile. So I was able to work out if this theory works itself out. So this theory here is just saying that the brake horsepower of a car equals the weight times by the speed divided by 234 cubed. Sounds complicated, but it's actually fairly simple. Now, if I put these numbers in to the calculator, it actually comes out at, I think it was, for this time, it came out at about 270 horsepower. Now, I dynoed it at 330. That could be explained for things like my bad driving. It could have been either the temperature of the day, all that kind of stuff. But actually, I remember this day quite clearly, and I was having trouble from getting the tires to hook up. So I turned my boost down. So I had two settings on my car. I had the full boost at 17, I think it was 17 point something PSI, and that gave me 330 horsepower at the dyno. I then had a lower boost setting of around 15 PSI. And on that day, I was actually running the lower PSI for this run, where I got my good time of 13.6, because I was actually able to hook up the tires at 105 miles an hour. So 105 divided by 234 cubed times by the weight comes out at about 270 horsepower. So that was pretty cool. Now, I remember I said in the other earlier in the video that I actually had a time where I couldn't remember my time, but I remember that I finished at 115 miles per hour. If you put that into the calculator, you get something like 227 bhp, which is very accurate. So for my MR2, this actually came out as pretty good calculators. My Dodge Charger, which is a track pack car, so it's designed for quarter mile, so it's been tested a bunch, and the numbers they give out are specifically for geeks like me who want to know that before they buy the car. So in this case, the car's clearly a lot heavier, but it has a bit more power, and that actually means that it pretty much gets down the quarter mile in exactly the same time. So my MR2, I should have been getting probably 12 point something seconds. In fact, I think you can work out some of this using this calculator. So let me just pull up an actual calculator. So I did 115 miles an hour. So let's do 1353 divided by 115. So actually that's 11.7 seconds. So my car should have been probably around 12 seconds. And I had a friend who had a car that was very similar to mine, and he actually was in the low 12s. So my terrible driving is what I kind of attributed to that, really. But back to my Charger, these are times by a good driver, mostly based on repeatability and mathematics. So this holds for this car as well. So that means we can have a look at the Firebird. So we know the weight. Obviously, mine, could be slightly different. I'm heavier than some people, so this number can change, but so far it's been pretty good for these ones, and we reckon that it's got about 150 horsepower. So what does that mean? I'm just looking at my my notes over here. So based on these numbers, that looks like we should be good for about a 15.5 second quarter mile at about, 80 something. Let me just calculate that real quick. 87 miles per hour. So I've already got a car that's faster than this, and I've had a car that's faster than this. So I need to work out, if I want to be faster than these, how much horsepower do I need? So my target would be, let's just say, to be as good as my best run, which was the 13.6 and the 13.7 that my Charger theoretically can do in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing. So 105 miles an hour, so clearly I'm going to need some more power. So based on that, I think, reversing these, so that we're using the weight of 28 and the miles per hour of 105, it comes out at 200 and probably around, let me see, about 260 horsepower. Now that's not bad. That's actually quite achievable. I could do that by just changing the heads and cam on the car I've got. 260 horsepower out of a 5-litre V8 engine. That's pretty doable. I mean, it's only, 110 more than stock, and I've seen people do way more than that. So that's actually quite doable. But that would only get me to the 105, so that would be status quo, which is a good target to get to originally. But if I want to get to the 115 miles an hour that I did one time, I would be looking a lot more, sort of like 300 and something horsepower. So I have a calculator here. So I'm just using a website called TCI Automotive. They've got a website, and they've got some of these formulas plugged into their website, so you can just go and enter these numbers. So miles per hour, I'm talking about doing 115, and the weight of 2865. So that's 340. 340 brake horsepower. So that's actually a lot higher than the 150. That's, way more than twice the power. So at this point, we know that I could probably get to the 105 with what I have, but to get to doing 115 miles an hour, I'm going to need a lot more power. So that's why I picked up that spare engine with the car, because a 350 Chevy small block engine, 300 horsepower is pretty easy. So I can go for 340. It would be not a stretch, but it would be an interesting project to work on. But I kind of want to go a lot faster than that. This is a race car, dedicated race car. So this is just my beginning numbers. But yeah, it's fun that you can use these numbers, and you can actually, like this, my MR2 is well documented. So I was actually able to use that and these calculations to work stuff out. So pretty happy with that. And that's my first goal, is to get probably around 300 horsepower. I think would be a pretty nice number. So as well as knowing how fast the car can go based on a certain horsepower and weight, we can also look at the gearing. Now, it's all very good that you give the car a lot of power, but can you even use that power to get to the speed you want? Now, there's a more of sort of theory around that kind of thing, and it's all to do with the gearbox and the drive ratios. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. So I wanted to talk about the second part of some race theory, and that is gearing. Now, gearing, you think about gearboxes, but there is actually a lot more to gearing in a car than just the gearbox. So I just wanted to quickly kind of go over that now. This is very rough theory. I'm not going to go into too much detail. There's lots of other videos out there that can go into a lot more detail than that. But in the last video, we talked about the fact that once you get up to say like 300 horsepower, you start overpowering the small tires that come on your car. When you change tires, one of the reasons you do that is for contact patch. So if we imagine I've got my skinny little wheel and tire around it, and this is the ground, the contact patch is just this little piece here. Okay? So this little piece here. So this is the contact patch. So when you put more power to the car, this contact patch needs to get bigger. Now, obviously, one way you can do it is very simply just to buy a much wider tire. That sounds easy. The problem is, the wider the tire goes, either the further it sticks out of the car, or if you're going in, you might have some suspension. If you've got your coilovers here, that could hit the tire. So going super wide is not always as easy as it might think. So what's the other thing you can do? Well, you can go for a taller tire. So same size wheel, stick a really big tire on it. Doesn't have to be super wide, but you can see this contact patch is now so much bigger. So that's why people put bigger wheels. So if you imagine those drag cars, they've got like these two wheels here, and then they've got the guy to sit in there in the cage, and then they've got the little wheels at the front, and a massive, great big engine here. That looks like a typical drag racing car. Now that's because they have these giant tires. So, why am I talking about that? Well, the size of the tire really affects gearing. So there's a few different things that affect the gearing. There's the engine speed, the RPM of the engine. Then there's the gearbox, the rear differential, and finally the tire. Now the tire makes a difference, because if you imagine we're talking about doing a quarter mile, you can, if your tire is 25 inches tall and you work out what the rolling radius of that is, you can only turn that many times to get down a quarter mile, because by the time it's rolled, that's how far a quarter mile is. So in order to get that to turn quicker, you have to work kind of backwards back to the engine. So one thing is, you've got your engine has a red line, or the perfect point at which it creates power. So if you've ever been to a dyno, you normally get like two things on the graph. You normally get like a torque curve like this, and then sometimes you get like a horsepower curve, whatever. And then where these two kind of meet, or where the horsepower is the maximum, that is your peak horsepower. So you're creating power between, the optimal thing is between here. So that could be, say, 2,500 RPM and say 5,000 RPM. So in order to be completely optimal at going down the quarter mile, you need to be in that power. Because remember, we talked about in the last video that I need 300 horsepower. Well, if I'm driving and I'm only getting the power down, like if I'm only getting like 10 horsepower down here, then I'm not getting 300 horsepower. 300 horsepower is up at 5,000 RPM. So we want to stay at that as long as possible. So you can think a lot about this as, if you've ever ridden a bicycle, you have so much power. And if you start in a very high gear, it's really hard and you're not going very quickly. So if you were in a race with somebody, you would be losing because you're trying really hard to get going. So what you do is you change gears. You go down to a lower gear, and then, or a higher gear, sorry, and then you can start pedaling really fast. So you're at your optimum power, and then once you're going, you can change gear and keep going until you're starting to go really fast, and then you win the race. And cars are absolutely identical. There's just a lot more moving parts. So the way that these numbers all kind of play into part is based on this here is a very nice representation of how this all kind of works together. So imagine you just on a quarter mile, you just flat out, you just nail it. Well, this is going to start going up and up and up and up. So as the RPM increases, you're going to start going faster. So you get to say 5,000 RPM, and then you have to change gear. So that drops the RPM slightly, and then you're in the next gear. Now, these ratios here are to do with the gearing. So the first gear on a 700 R4 is 3.06, which means the engine has to turn 3.06 times in order for the gearbox to put that out behind it. So then once we change to the second gear, we're already going quickly. Remember, when you're riding a bike, it's easier to change into the second gear than it was the first gear. So now we go to 1.62, so this is going to change the angle of this graph. So then we get to second gear. So now we're doing, say, 90 miles an hour. It drops down again. And then we're into third, 1 to 1. So the engine, for every rotation of the engine, the gearbox output shaft is now turning 1 to 1. So, you know, if we're doing, say, 2,500 revolutions per minute, in a minute, that's how many times the wheels should turn if it was all 1 to 1, or should I say the drive shaft is going to turn. So again, there, and then we're doing like 100 miles an hour, and it shifts. I'm sorry, we don't over rev the car, blow the engine up. It shifts, and then we finally, you know, going off into the overdrive speed. So based on this, we want to see at 5,000 RPMs how fast will we be going. Now, I can't remember the exact numbers for my car. I do have some notes, but let's just say that it would be maybe 120. Now, we know we don't have enough horsepower to get that done in a quarter mile. We have enough horsepower to do, say, I think it's 87 miles an hour. So our horsepower is actually going to limit us down to here, which means that we're actually wasting stuff. We're only going to probably be in second gear by the time we get down there. Now, if I change this tire to a nice big sticky tire, and I go for like 28-inch slicks, this graph is going to look even worse. Because remember, it's like trying to start your bike in a high high gear. It's going to be like, oh, and then it's going to go up to 5,000, and then it's going to go like this, and then down again. And the top speed, I'm going to be able to do like 200 miles an hour. Of course, I'd need like 500, 600, 700 horsepower to do that. So my car's not going to do that, which means that I'm going to get down the quarter mile, and I'm probably going to only be doing like 80 miles an hour at the end of it. So, because by the time I've got up to my power, I'm not going to be doing that. So that is actually kind of counterintuitive as to why, you know, what you're trying to do. So you put big tires on, and then you can't do it. Now you can obviously change all the gears inside the gearbox, but that gets incredibly expensive and very specialized. So the other thing you can do is this differential. So mine currently has a 2.73 to 1 ratio. So say when I'm in third gear, I'm actually getting 2.7. If I was in first gear, I'm actually gearing that down, so it's going to be like, well, I can't remember how you work it out, but it's probably going to be like 5 times to 1 or whatever it is. So what you can do is you can change this. So if I change this to a 373 gear set, it's going to bring that graph right back up again. So I can start really climbing up high, change gear, and then up again, change gear, up again, change gear, and then across. And that's going to make it so that by the time I'm in like third gear, I can be down here. And that was a terrible, terrible diagram, but let's say it was over here, and that means I can get to the 105 miles an hour or 115 miles an hour that I was aiming for. So by changing the tires and the differential, you can kind of alter this graph a little bit. Now, obviously, once you really start getting into things, the more power you have, the easier it is to turn. So I could not change that, and the power would overcome these 28-inch tires, and I'd be able to, you know, do that. But I'm doing it cheap. I'm only trying to get 300 horsepower to begin with. So The other thing you can do, of course, is if you change your heads and cam for a high revving, matched engine, you could rev up to 6,000 RPM, and then that would change this graph considerably as well. So it would go all the way up here before it changes, and then it'd come down and then go all the way back up to here and then change, and then all the way back up to here, and so that by the time I'm in third gear I'm doing 130 miles an hour. So that's perfect. So that's another way of doing it, is to raising the RPM of your car, but that includes rebuilding the engine. So there's a lot to think about here, but basically I think I'm going to go for a 28-inch drag slick, and I'm going to change the rear differential for a C373. That also gives me a chance to pull it apart and put a locker in there. The locker is going to change, so you've got your car here, your engine, nice big V8, and then you've got your transmission, drive shaft, and then you've got your pumpkin at the back here, and then your nice tyres. So currently my car has an open differential, which means the power goes to the tyre that has the most traction. So it'll go to this one, and then this one won't do anything, or it'll just spin. So with a locker, you lock these two together. Now there's a couple of different types, I can get into that later when I get into this section, but essentially that's another way of combating the issue of having too much power for the tyre. So instead of having to go for these crazy great big wide tyres, I can go for tyres half the size, but make sure that both of them are driven at the same time. So as well as knowing how much horsepower we need to make and what sort of gearing we need to look at, we can now start looking at parts and things. Well, there's a few things broken with the car. It needs new tyres all the way around, probably new wheels to go with those tyres, because they're currently on 14-inch wheels, and that's not really a standard nowadays. 15 and 17 are more standardized. So looking at wheels and tyres. We also need to look at the radiator, which I bought one online, but we haven't fitted it yet. The other thing was that obviously the exhaust is not really set up very well. And the brakes. I remember when I pulled in after driving it for the first time, the brakes were almost non-existent, so we need to look at those. So coming up on the next episode, we'll probably look at fitting those things, but I am going to start looking at purchasing those ahead of the next show. So let me know what you thought about this episode. There's not a lot of original content in it, but I have been playing around with new cameras and new lighting setup and things, and playing around with the 3D. I did render all those things myself. Got a lot of the images off of Turbo Squid, the actual models, but I did a lot of the animation and things myself. And also the artwork that you saw in the little skit, that was mine original. I did it with my iPad and my Apple Pencil. So let me know what you thought of that kind of stuff as well, and look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Cheerio.